Sure. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad that you could join us for this presentation this morning on COVID-19 and the impact on grants. The New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence is really excited to work with Diane Leonard, who is going to be leading us through the presentation this morning. Diane is a New Yorker, and really pleased and excited to have this opportunity to work with her. She's done a tremendous amount of grant writing. Has some great experience. I think that's really going to help us think through some next steps into the future of fundraising and development in grants, and in particular looking to some ideas and strategies. And I'm hopeful that are really going to help us stretch and grow and learn more about ways that we can continue to elevate the need for services and support for survivors of domestic violence. So again, I want to say a big welcome to everyone. Feel free to put questions in the chat box. Diane is ready to kind of shift into that mode as well to be able to respond to anything else that might come up during the course of the presentation. So with that said, Diane, I'll turn things back over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Connie. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us for the session. I know that you are very, very busy implementing your missions, working with your communities and those you serve. And so anytime that you spend on anything beyond direct mission delivery, well, I'm honored that you're with us. And so we're going to talk today about, well, what in the world is happening in the grants world as a result of COVID. The answer could be long, it could be winding. Honestly, I really could just hand and ship everyone a magic 8-ball as we try to figure out what's next. But the good news is we have some tips and some strategies from our team and our colleagues about how we've been handling it, how we think that you can handle it in your organizations. So as we get started, just a little bit about me. So I'm a certified grant professional. That's through the Grant Professional Certification Institute, which is an affiliate organization of the Grant Professionals Association. And so GPA, as we usually refer to it, huge international association for grant writers and grant professionals. And I'm honored that I'm one of 33 approved trainers for them. So to be clear, it doesn't mean I have all the answers about grants, but I've got a lot, and I know where to connect to if you have other questions, and love to talk about best practices. So it's not just that I teach about grants or I'm certified for writing grants, but it also is that I was a grant maker first. So I started my career on the other side of the grant seeking equation, and I was making grants, well, more years than I might want to admit ago. But I've been on both sides, still serve as a reviewer, still work with grant makers now as clients and with grant seekers. So I have a really, I think, interesting perspective by having one foot in each side of the conversation. Probably what's most important to know about me though, fueled by running and coffee. And good news, that's all been taken care of today. So I'm incredibly excited for the conversation. Now, as Connie mentioned, really by being in Zoom, I know that it's not as great as if we were all in a room together and you could raise your hand and we could have a bigger group discussion. But that chat box is really helpful at any point. If you have a question or a discussion point, please feel free to go ahead and raise it in the chat box. If you prefer, you could use the raise hand feature in the participant list, then I'll be able to see that you've got something you'd like to say. At any point, feel free to use either of those features. We will end today with an open-ended Q&A discussion format. And if that takes us past the hour, that certainly is fine. I'm happy to stay and facilitate those questions in the discussion as needed. But what we're going to do today is think about how it is that we communicate with our grant makers. And actually, I'm going to broaden it a little more past COVID, because I think the fact that we're dealing with both COVID-19 issues as nonprofit organizations, thinking about what that means, we also then have grant makers who are thinking about the way in which they might be different because of the racial equity conversations and issues that are happening throughout the country. And so we're actually seeing two different types of crises that are influencing philanthropy. So this conversation today will help apply to both of those topics. We'll be talking about those that are in your organization that we call your grant team. Don't worry, I'll define what that means to us. And then we'll talk about how we stay on top of the fire hose of information that is really coming our way about grant opportunities. So that's our plan for our time together today. Again, that chat box at any point, hop on in so that we can ensure that I'm giving you the best answer or clarifying if you have a concern. So when we think about what our job is, if we put on our grant hat, actually, let's find out. In that chat box for me, if you could type in a Y for yes or an N for no, how many of you have other responsibilities beyond grants in your organization? So how many of you are wearing many hats, not only grants? Oh, okay, that's what I thought. Lots of yeses. Lots of you are wearing many hats. A few of you have the opportunity to focus exclusively on grants, but most of the times you're trading hats. So for today's conversation, you've put the grant hat on. And when that hat is on, what is your job? Yes, you're right. Secure money for your organization. But actually, it's something bigger than that. Organizations often feel stressed out about grants. I don't know if you've ever felt that way. But in a time of crisis, in a time of uncertainty, and definitely we are in such a time, if you as the grant professional, when that hat is on, if you can have a calm presence, if you can let your colleagues know that you have it under the best control that's available to you at this moment, if you can have that approach, that will keep your colleagues from feeling stressed out about grants in a way that maybe isn't going to be helpful. This meme, it usually actually comes out on International Grant Professionals Day. That's when it's circulating around on social media the most. Ironically, if you didn't know about International Grant Professionals Day, it legitimately was March 13th of this year, because it's always the second Friday in March. It's an awkward day to now always remember, when was IGPD in 2020? Oh, right, the day that our lives went remote. So this meme is no longer just about IGPD, it's about every day in our work as a grant professional. Now, here's why I use this as the way that we start the conversation today. Because let's think about our activities and our life cycle and our best practices in grants. Your organizations have been successfully securing grants in order to implement your mission. So you were probably doing some combination of research and relationship buildings, and of course, the writing and the reporting for when you had gotten the money. So if we think about how we communicate with our grant makers, let's be honest, everything has changed in so many ways about what our day-to-day activities look like. And if we go bigger picture though, back to that life cycle, everyone's like, so what do I have to do differently? Well, the best practices, maybe this is reassuring, the best practices stay exactly the same. So while so much around us is completely different, our grant-seeking best practices, the same. Our grant life cycle is exactly the same. We always need to worry, if we're thinking about a circular life cycle, we always start at the very top of the circle by thinking about our grant readiness. And then we think about grant research. We think about who are going to be our great funders, who would be a good fit for us, what's changing with our current funders. We use all that to build our relationships. So have email conversations or phone conversations, or have our board talk to their board. We use that to inform our writing. We do it so well, we do the happy dance and get to report, and then we start all over. It didn't change. The life cycle is still exactly the same circular cycle. Now, here's what's most important. While the best practices stay the same, what happens in that relationship section, it was always important. It wasn't always possible with grant makers. They didn't always have capacity or preference. They still might not have capacity or preference. Maybe some that had preference before don't now, or vice versa. But the cycle is the same. And so when we think about communicating, I actually want to jump into that portion of the life cycle, Because if we think about what it sounds like when we talk to our grant makers, has it changed? What should we be saying? Back to the chat box, please, if you don't mind. I'd like to hear from you. How many of your organizations, this is a safe space, so moment of truth, how many of you have talked directly with all of your grant makers at least once in the last 6 months about how your organization is handling COVID? So give me a Y for yes or an N for no. How many of your organizations have already talked at least once in the last 6 months to all of your grant makers to say, this is how we're handling COVID? Oh, awesome. I'm seeing a ton of people typing Y's into the chat box. That's fantastic. Okay, some are saying many, but not all. That's a good start. Here's the second question then. It's been 6 months, actually just a touch more than 6 months. So definitely you want to have communicated at least once. But a lot's changed, right? Each month feels like a year, each day feels like a month. It's a long 6 months. So for those of you that have already talked to all your grant makers and you said, I talked to all of them at least once, how many of you would still put your hand up, give me another Y or N, how many of you have talked to them at least twice in the last 6 months? Has anyone talked to their grant makers more than once? Okay, some, not all, might become more of the common answer. So what does it sound like? Why are we reaching out to grant makers? Usually, when we think about what that implementation process looks like, you've got the grant, you're doing the good work, you've got your report, you might express sincere gratitude once or twice in the year in a different way, an extra handwritten note, or you share a publication that was highlighting some of your great results. Why am I asking you about how many times you're actually communicating to a grant maker in a much shorter period of time than the normal 1-year grant cycle? Because everything's changing so fast, both for you and, quite honestly, for the grant maker as well. So if you haven't talked to your grant makers yet, or maybe if you're thinking about reaching out again, I want to give you some talking points that you could use when you reach out. And I'm framing these as talking points that we would use ideally via the phone first. I know it feels like I'm saying something old school, like let's pick up the phone. Whereas a lot of us, email feels really safe and it feels like we're not disturbing our grant makers and that they can read it at their leisure. But we want to connect in the most personal way to our current grant makers. I'm not talking about those that might be new funders, but to our current grant makers. And so if we can connect with them via phone, that would be our personal recommendation for you, is to get on the phone with them, because it gives you the opportunity for a richer dialogue, so that when you start the conversation by asking how they're doing and how the organization is doing, make it about them first before you talk about yours, about your organization, your work, and how you're handling it. See what they're saying, right? It gives the opportunity for some meaningful personal dialogue. And so when you share how your organization is handling the crisis, should this be the moment where we make everything shiny and rosy? No, this is a moment of truth. How are we handling the situation? I have to say that the news probably helps you in some ways, because as you talk about not only how your organization is handling the crisis, are you still remote? Are you remote part of the time? How is your team handling safety protocols? Right? You're going to have some very logistical things, but the news, I would say, has done a fairly good job, and I'm generalizing across networks, so maybe some are better than others, maybe some regions are better than others, but talking about what's happening in terms of domestic violence as a result of how people are handling the stress of COVID and what's happening and the increase in incidents, that's been publicly shared in the news enough that many grant makers won't be surprised to hear that while you're handling a lot of logistical crisis things as a team, how do we work as a team? How do we stay safe? They're also going to know that there's an increased need and demand for your service. that you can point to some of those stories to say the need for our work is greater than ever. And here's how we're adjusting to that within the framework of COVID. Okay? And I'm curious, of those of you that have talked to grant makers, have you asked directly for the loosening of any of your funds that have been designated? Have you asked for them to loosen them, either so that you can move them to other categories, maybe a little more at will, or so that they actually become general operating dollars? Raise your hand. Has anyone been brave enough to ask for that change within their grant funding? I say brave because that takes a lot to ask your grant makers to consider changing what the grant might have looked like. Okay, so some of you haven't asked. Maybe you didn't need to. Maybe things were okay as is and there wasn't a lot of pressure. But I encourage you, as you move forward, be honest with the grant makers. If there is a need, maybe it's because program design has shifted, maybe it's because of the way that your organization is handling other budget constraints right now or other changes in your fundraising. If there would be a need, if there would be a reason that it would be really amazing for the grant maker to loosen restrictions on your funding, you should not hesitate to ask. In a normal year, we would tell you, you do what you said you would do, you spend your budget the best way possible, given that that's what your plan was. Nope, we are not in normal times. If it would be helpful to your organization to have your budget, your restrictions modified, these are supposed to be your funding partners. If you're being honest about what's happening during the time of crisis, you should ask for a modification. What's the worst they'll say? No. But what are they very likely to say if you ask? They're very likely to say yes. Now, this is just one story of reaching out. And you might say, well, if I've worked with a funder for a long time, I might be more comfortable asking for them to maybe change the way that our budget looks this year. But if it's a brand new funder, if we've only been with them for a little bit, not even a whole year, you might be nervous. So I want to share with you an inspirational story so that it's not just a Cinderella story idea, something that's, oh, wouldn't that be nice if? This is a New York State-based organization, so I'm keeping it within the boundaries of the state. I'm trying to keep it as close to you as I can. But it was a health system that had a relatively new corporate foundation supporter. And so they were really nervous because it wasn't a very personal relationship. In fact, they had all sorts of contacts within this organization, and they just weren't really sure what would happen if they said, you know, we could use a slight modification. Actually, it's a little more than slight. I would call it a pretty good size modification because the program design was looking different. People weren't together in the way that they needed for the original program design. And so when they phoned, they started using the talking points. How are you doing? How are things with the organization? And as they continued through the conversation, before they could actually get to, you know, it'd be really helpful if we made a modification, the staff was like, okay, so like, what do we need to do differently? Do you need any changes? What do you think? What could we do to support you in this moment? They were thinking, just like the other party. Everyone's worried about each other. And they were trying to think about how they could use the dollars to still create impact and to support their partners. So let's remember that our grant makers, they exist and they give the money because they have a mission. They have a goal that they're trying to achieve with the funding. And it's something that is parallel to your mission. So we want to be honest with them because the way in which we're implementing our missions for both of us might look a little bit different right now. We want to be honest about what's changing so that we can support each other. They might realize as a result of your conversation about some other things. What's happening in the field? How might they help you differently next time? Because while everything's changing in program delivery and service delivery as the communities make their way through the pandemic, let's be honest, grant makers are remaking themselves. They're also sitting back and saying, are we going to continue to do work the same way we always have? Are we changing our priorities? Are we changing our priorities as a result of COVID? Are we changing our priorities as a result of the racial equity conversations happening in our communities? They are also in a deep period of self-analysis and trying to figure out, who are we? Okay, maybe not all foundations, maybe not all grant makers, but many are. So the more open you are about the conversation, I think the better the long-term funding partnership results. Now, this is about your current grant makers. Back to that chat box. How many of you are researching or looking for new funders to support your work? Who wants some new funding? Anyone? I'm guessing all your hands are up. You're like, yes, I need more funding. We always do, right? So how do we handle new funder relationships when they didn't know who we were pre-COVID, pre-pandemic? They didn't understand how awesome we were before. So how are they going to help us as we try to remain awesome, but in a slightly new, different way? Well, when we think about our research, this is something that's really important. When we go backwards in the life cycle from relationship development, our research, all of a sudden, our tools, Foundation Directory Online, Grant Station, eCivis, any way that we get to the Funders 990, all of a sudden they're really potentially outdated. They're always lagging, but when we do research, they are now in a very risky way outdated, because we don't know, based on that IRS filing, based on therefore the database records, what have they changed in the last 6 months, right? We just don't know. So their website might give us some clues that they're in the midst of some process changes, or they're in some strategic visioning conversations. In fact, we might get better clues about what they're thinking, how they as grant-making organizations are reacting using their social media, because that's the most current information sometimes we can find about grant makers. But so we need to find out what clues are there about current changes. There's what their material said. Have they given any indicators of changes in the last 6 months? So that we are prepared, not just with talking points for outreach based on their database information, but based on what we've read that they've released in the last few months. So now when we reach out, maybe via phone, if they still allow for phone calls. It feels like right now we're slightly heavier on email, since some folks are still remote and not all phone calls are forwarded, but whether it's email or phone call, our talking points are the same. We reach out and we say, hi, I'm so-and-so from, fill in the blank for your organization name. And if they're outside of the state, let's make sure that they know where we are, that we're in New York State. If we're not in New York City, let's make sure they know where in the big, broad definition of upstate we might be. We don't want to tell them our whole history. We don't want to tell them when we were founded. We don't want to tell them all our programs and services. Rather, we want to say why we think we're a good fit based on their mission and goals, based on what we've currently been able to see about their work, so that we can let them react. Based on what we see about your current priorities, this is why we think we're a good fit. Does that align with your current focus? Give them the opportunity to say, oh, actually, our website is out of date. We've just released some new guidelines. We'll be rolling them out in a month. Or you're right, those are still our current focus areas. Very interesting. I'd love to talk more. Right? We're trying to get them to point us in one of two directions. That way, you can share a little bit about, okay, great, here's how we're navigating, here's the questions I have about how we might want to partner. We can move towards some of our normal conversation. But before we do that, we need to confirm first, are your guidelines that we're looking at, is that right? Is that still accurate? Because that's going to influence whether the relationship conversation continues, and especially, do we still think that it's a good fit? Should we apply? And really, I joked about the magic 8-ball earlier. I'd probably use it again here, because if we were trying to predict which grant makers are shifting and which are staying the same, I have been surprised time and time again. So we can't make any assumptions about who's making what change or who's staying the same. We need to directly ask because, well, yep, all bets are off. Hard to tell. So we make that outreach. Hold on though, I know exactly what one of your concerns are, or at least I'm predicting it based on the number of times I've had this COVID impact conversation. So pre-COVID, as a general rule, we were very concerned. We didn't want to bug funders. We were trying to think about how to respect their time and their preferences and their capacity. But now, in the pandemic, 6 months after March 13th, we're like, definitely, I don't want to interrupt them. I don't want to bother them. What if they're working remotely? What if they're working from home and they're balancing virtual school for their children? Why would they want to talk to me now? They want to talk to you now because they still have funds that they need to grant in order to achieve their mission. And you have something that they want. You have programs and services that are mission driven that align with their goals. So they want to talk to you because they're worried. How are nonprofits doing? How are those we support or potentially could support? How are they handling things right now? How can we be sure that our funds are doing the best work possible post-COVID? In the middle of racial equity conversations, how can we ensure that our funding is really as impactful as possible? Those are the sort of things that keep them up at night. So we want to still reach out. We want to set aside that fear that they might not be able to talk to us or they might not want to talk to us and really spend time on this outreach. So when we think about our grant makers, whether they're current, and so they've been funding partners for at least a few months, maybe a few years, or whether we're thinking about some brand new ones. They're trying to create impact. So are you, and so we all need each other during this time of crisis. It's just that it's all, well, let's be honest, stressful for each of us. Everyone's got things going on. I keep saying it's not that we're all in the same boat, right? But it's that we're all in the same storm. In the nonprofit community, we are definitely not all in the same boat, but we're all in the same storm. And so we've seen some grant makers, actually there's a great example in the Adirondacks, the Adirondack Community Foundation and the Sun Fund that they put together. There are grant makers that they're just turning things upside down. They're doing things differently. And the example there is that they were taking applications. They quickly changed a process so that instead of taking some time for decisions to be made, they were meeting every few days and cutting checks also within a few days for those who were coming to them for funding. So when we think about how grant makers are reacting, all bets are off. Sometimes they're amazing stories. Sun Fund, great example. Occasionally, the grant makers do react from a place of stress, and it's not exactly what we would have hoped for. There is a story, it's a foundation out of California though, so for the most part, we'll just set them aside. They did cancel all LOI invitations for full proposals. They said, you can start over later. So there are stories like that floating around, where there were some grant makers who did operate from a position of stress. But for the most part, we're in this storm together. The grant maker grantee relationship still a little imbalanced, but we need each other more than ever. So there's my soapbox about communicating with grant makers. I hope that maybe the biggest takeaway is, oh right, I need to keep prioritizing my outreach, my updates, that my normal MO that I would talk to a grant maker or reach out once or twice a year, or maybe once outside of my reports, that's old school. During the crisis, during pandemic, we need to increase our level of communication so that they're aware of what we're doing, of how we're handling it, and maybe even how they can help. Now, many of you are wearing all the hats, or at least lots of hats. That's a lot of pressure if I'm telling you that you used to have to prioritize some relationship outreach, and now you need to prioritize more relationship outreach. I get it. I have just given you a big to-do item and your calendars are already full. This is where your grant team could help. So how do we define grant team? You're wearing lots of hats. How many of you think you have a grant team or know that you have a grant team? Let's go back to that chat box for another quick Y or N so I can get a sense of what you think. How many of you have a grant team in your organization? Don't worry, I'll define what it is in a moment. Just want to get a sense for those of you where that team language already resonates. Okay, good. Some of you do. Fantastic. For those of you that are like, Diane, I write the grants. What does grant team mean? Let me give you a quick definition. It's the group of colleagues that have a stake in your grant application being successful. It rarely means that you have a team of grant writers all together in one organization. That is rarely what it actually means. It usually means that you have a cross-functional group within the organization. In small organizations, it might be just about everybody. But you've got someone that might help with additional program information, someone that would help with finance. If you are not the senior leader, maybe someone that gives those senior leadership approvals or input. It might even be an intern or a board member that's helping to contribute to your applications or to your research efforts or to your relationship building, or maybe to how you say thank you to grant makers on social media. Lots of different ways that we define it. But grant teams, pre-COVID, were always the key to a sustainable grant-seeking strategy. What do I mean by sustainable? Not only that you're generating grant revenue, which we know is a key to the definition of success here, but that it's sustainable, that it's not burning out the person primarily worried about grants, that it's something that the organization can continue to grow and evolve together, that it's not reliant only on one person's relationships, but so sustainable, both in pace and in terms of knowledge sharing across the team. Okay, so now that you've got my really quick definition of what that means, they were always the key to success. They are more important now than ever. So if we think about what's happening around our organization, remember the quick image we started with about just stay calm, let the grant professional handle it. If we think about what happens if we're all in our teams going in different directions, handling what's on our list and our job description, on our to-do items, the overwhelm of all the things that are changing could really, it could change the culture of our organization, at least in the short term, in a way that's stressful, that's not sustainable. But if we can come together and focus on these grant-seeking efforts, focus on the increased need for relationship conversation, we can flip this game, and instead of letting the pandemic stress us out in our grant-seeking strategy, we can get that stress running. We can chase it. So we want to use our grant team, as I mentioned, the definition of having a stake in seeing grants be successful. We can use those colleagues to our organization's advantage. I get it. This is a competitive game. And so you might feel like sometimes, while we usually work together as a network, you're trying to work together whenever possible. Sometimes you might feel like you're competing against your peers on the line or against others in your community. But so these grant teams, they want to help us get the funding in these competitive situations. And the reality, they don't have to be on your org chart. Doesn't need to be in the job description. It can be formal, informal. It can be Zoom-based. It can be in person. You can meet once a month. You can talk on email about what the actual applications look like when they open. It looks different in every organization. The important part is that your colleagues recognize, maybe you help open their eyes to recognize how important their work is in your organization's overall success for grant seeking. So when we think about what you need from your colleagues, their ideas, their inspiration, their buy-in, their energy, their support, so that we can make great grant applications. And the grant team recognizes, I say our, not that we really possess the grant money, right? But if you're the lead person writing, it feels personal, we take the responsibility. Our colleagues, they need the grant money to do the great work. Our colleagues also need a space to brainstorm. You know, if we could do this, wow, that would make a real difference right now for our clients or for our community. They need a space to know that while resources are really tight, here's where we can brainstorm and make sure that we understand new ideas so that when opportunities arise, maybe we can find a match for funding. They need to understand that the grant makers, while sometimes the reporting might stress us out or making the outreach might stress us out, that the community as a whole, the philanthropic community, wants to support your organization. So how do we engage our grant team? Well, you might say that, you know, sharing caffeine and making sure if you're together that there's some good office snacks available, just having some nice check-in moments, sure, that can really be helpful to emotionally support each other through the work. But what is really the most important way that your grant team's going to help you right now? When you're writing your applications, you need information from them. But everyone's plate is really full. It was always full, it's fuller than ever now, right? It's almost more like you've gone to an all-you-can-eat buffet and your eyes were bigger than your stomach and now things are just falling off the plate. And maybe you didn't choose to put it all on, but there's a lot to do. How do we gather that information in a way that is easy-ish for our colleagues and stress-reducing for us? This is something that we have found to be a concern across organizations of all sizes and types, always, but more so now than before. So when we think about gathering information from our colleagues, we recognize that they are overwhelmed, that they have a lot to do, that folks are juggling different things personally, that just there's a lot happening, right? And so we try to figure out what's the best way to get the information. This is what sometimes leads to what a colleague of mine, Cheryl Kester, calls MSU. I lived in Michigan for years. So at first I was like, MSU, is that Michigan State University? No. This is something that almost always exists in our world as grant writers, grant professionals, but during times of crisis, we see it skyrocket. It's our need, it's our feeling that we might have to make stuff up. And I am not saying in any way that we should. No, absolutely not. It's the opposite. We have the feeling like, how am I going to know what to put in there? I can't get the information I need. We shouldn't be making stuff up. We shouldn't be filling in blanks unless we are the subject matter expert for that project or program. Then we can fill in the blanks because we're the subject matter expert. But if we have that feeling where it's Mad Lib style, like I've got some blanks and I don't know what to go here, this is a method that we have found to be critical in the last 6 months. Not just some of the time, but every time, so that your colleagues know what is expected of them when you're writing an application, because this information they're going to give you, if you get the money, which you're going to get it because you're doing your work so well, right? You want to happy dance and get it. You don't want the implementation to be stressful. You don't want there to be an, uh-oh, we asked for something in a way that isn't exactly what we want, or things have changed and now what do we do? So when we're writing our applications and we draft our narrative, if we're addressing this idea that MSU, that there is information we need, the best thing that we can do to help our colleagues help us is to frame out the narrative. I've got an example here on the left-hand side of the screen. Frame out basic narrative and then leave a space. Maybe we know that we don't have a project name yet. That's often something folks are trying to find. So we don't have a project name yet, let's put that there. Or we don't know how many students we're going to serve, so we put in a hashtag there. But then we can put a comment in the margin. Whether we're in Google Docs or Word, we can put a comment. Mary, can you help with this? You're asking for a very specific answer. Tom, can you give me this number? And now, instead of having the pressure, I've got to give them a sentence. Do they need bullet points? What is it they want? You've made a very distinct ask that feels bite-sized, that feels manageable, that they can give you one answer at a time. We have found that to be an incredibly meaningful way to gather information when there's lots of other things happening, lots of demands on time. And when they read what you're asking for within the context of the other framing you put there, let's use the example on the screen, they might say, oh, actually, it's not only 7th and 8th because this isn't a junior high focused program, it's a middle school focused program. So it's 6th, 7th, and 8th in the districts we work with, or in our districts, it's 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. By giving you a space that you're asking for information and seeing the context around it, you might actually end up with better information as a result. Now, a clue that came to me, a great tip from one of my colleagues when we were talking about this MSU and how we frame and request information, was that their team, when they do this, you might feel like, oh, what if I miss my placeholder? It looks good if the comment were accidentally cleared. How do I make sure I don't miss one and accidentally submit it in a proposal? They always use 3 X's as their placeholder in front of any of these requests, so that when they're wrapping up and they're cleaning up and editing, they can do a quick Control F, right? So a quick control and find across the entire document for all the placeholders they had originally put in to make sure they didn't miss any. But this, if you're thinking about your colleagues, everyone's got a lot on their plate. This, while it seems very basic, is something that, if it's not done each and every time in all of your drafts, creates stress for your colleagues because they're not sure what's the right format. How should I give information? Do you need a sentence? Are bullets okay? Do you need 2 sentences? There's a lot of unknowns, and when there's many unknowns, then it feels like a bigger task for them to tackle than it might be. So you have to remember that your work, when you put on that grant hat, you are facilitating a grant team. Whether you call them that or not, you are facilitating the grant team. And the way in which you facilitate the team, maybe pre-COVID, is probably really different than how you facilitate it now, because you are the calming voice, the calming presence. When you think about what a facilitator is, and you think about, well, if I didn't use the word facilitate, how else would I describe it? Maybe as a coach, maybe as a cheerleader, maybe as the aggregator of things. So you want to focus on how you can set expectations for consistent communication, for consistently requesting information and giving 3 business days or 5 business days, not 2 hours notice, if at all humanly possible. It's your job to think about celebrating the victories, not only when you get the money, but also when you do things like submit letters of inquiry or get invited for full proposals or have a great conversation with a grant maker. Your work is more than just the writing. And so at least in the short term, for a successful grant seeking strategy to continue and be sustainable, you might have to up your facilitation game with your grant team just a little bit. You might have to turn the dial to the right a little bit, turn it up. And here's why. So what changed as a result of COVID? Everything, right? We still have to communicate and have relationship building efforts, but with more frequency and with a more focused approach on giving real time-based updates. This is what we're doing differently. This is how we need to use money differently. Things are not static in our work. We need to have a stronger emphasis on how we engage our colleagues, how we utilize our grant team members, how it is that we ask for meaningful feedback with as much notice and as much structure consistently as possible. And the reason is this, because so much is changing about the funding. Is there going to be more stimulus money? What stimulus money is there? How do we get it? Did we get our PPP loan? Do we get other CARES Act funding? Is there a new foundation grant? See where I'm going? I could keep speaking faster and faster and faster about all the things changing and all the new funding opportunities. How many of you, let's be honest, have gotten, we'll just say many, well-intentioned emails, phone calls, from board members or other leaders asking about all sorts of funding opportunities the last 6 months? I'm curious how many have gotten, we could almost call them somewhat nervous, panicked inquiries, but how many of you have gotten questions or comments about things like PPP and CARES Act and the COVID funding? How many of you are hearing from your board members or other members of your organization? I find that because everyone's just nervous, right? Like lots is changing in our personal lives and our professional lives. And so in particular, board members, they know that they have this responsibility to the organization. Senior leaders that might not be a part of your grant team, they have a huge responsibility on their shoulders. And so they're reading all the newsletters and they're going to all these free webinars, or they're trying to get you to go to all the free webinars to make sure that you don't miss anything. So I'll be honest, I have always had the fear of missing out. But I don't mean socially. Yes, I'm on Instagram and I love to see what people are up to, but that's not what I mean. I mean the fear of missing out about grant opportunities. If anyone else wants to self-identify as having FOMO related to grants, come join the club. It's not a scary place because we can be tactical about how we stay on top of things and prevent those 2 a.m., oh my gosh, what if I'm missing something sort of moments. So here's some of how our team stays on top of funding so that you can double check your processes to make sure you don't miss anything. So I call them steps because they're things you can check against your work. You might say, oh, I'm actually doing pretty well. Maybe this will help you feel more reassured. So what newsletters do you get? The answer is probably lots, I'm sure. But if we think about the newsletters with the filter of funding, what do we get for newsletters? Do we get opportunity newsletters? Do we get the Grant Professionals Association listings through GrantStation? Do we get the PND news briefings? Do we get the request for proposal listing every week from Candid? Do we subscribe to the National Council on Nonprofits? There are like lists of amazing places that we can get information, right? And so over time, our inboxes get really full. Here's what I suggest because there's just too many. Set time on your calendar either on Monday or Friday, or if you're really worried you might miss something, maybe Monday and Wednesday or Wednesday and Friday, and just filter all those newsletters, including the ones from Candid, including the ones from GrantStation, including the things that you've subscribed to maybe in grants.gov or the notices you get from Grants Gateway. Put all of them in one place and read them at one time so that you are focused in that moment on the idea of grant research, on the idea of upcoming opportunities, rather than context switching in your inbox, rather than being focused on one task and then going, oh, but oops, now I've got to think about grants for a minute. Let me switch hats. So if you can time box that, if you can put that in a space on your calendar at least once a week, maybe twice, depending on the volume of what you get, that will help you feel like you have a dedicated time. You're confident you're not missing anything because you're focused in this effort on reading what has come in. And if you can tell your colleagues, listen, I read all the things I get, all the things you forward to me, I look at them all on Mondays and Wednesdays. And I promise you, we wouldn't miss anything on those off days. If we can feel confident that I'm looking at that, I'm reading everything, please trust me. I put on the grant hat, I will send you anything worth discussion. Send me anything you get, but don't feel like you need to read it all. Say this to your colleagues, say this to your board, say these to your fellow leaders. I've got your back. I'm reading all the things. That will bring their stress level down. And if they know that when they see something or they have a question, they can just hit forward. They're not bothering you because you're going to look at it on Wednesday. They're just putting it in the queue to be researched. You can see their blood pressure come down. Now, what if there's no newsletter, or what if you're just generally worried? I'm worried that I'm going to miss a grant related to domestic violence and COVID. Does anyone have a fear like that? Anyone? So you can set up some different alerts. Let's say, for example, there's a grant maker and it's specific to your region. Maybe it's your community foundation that you want to watch. Maybe you don't think they always put out newsletters that you'll see, or maybe they mail them. Sometimes they're on Facebook. You're not sure where it's going to come from. You could set up a site alert for the funders you care about. You can use the free version of Visual Ping. That's one of the tools you could use, so that you will get an email update if the site changes. Now, remember how I said grant makers, their materials are a little outdated and they're not all keeping up with how fast they're changing their priorities right now? So this is great so that if they do change their site, at least you know. Can again help you kind of sleep at night, not have a 2 a.m. panic, like, I wonder if I missed it. So free account Visual Ping or similar tool is a great thing to add into those results. You can check them out, whether it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, etc. We also rely heavily on Google Alerts. And it's not an affiliate for Google. We get nothing for saying it. It works. Do any of you have Google Alerts set up related to your grant funding? Can I get a show of hands? Does anyone have Google Alerts set up? So we have found Google Alerts to be helpful as a way to cast that net over the unknown. So I've got a quick screenshot here of like the steps. How do you actually create a Google alert? But here's the framework. So if you think about what you might search, if you're like, how would I know and not miss a news article or something from a funder? You want to go high level so that you're getting a pretty good catchment area, because what we're trying to do is not let things slip by. And so if we set a Google alert, it might be New York State, domestic violence, COVID. It might be New York State, Erie County, domestic violence grants. It might be Jefferson County, domestic violence, coronavirus, right? We want to stay pretty broad. We want to set up a few different ones to see what we might catch. And when the results come in, I prefer digest so that I can just do a quick read of the link titles like once a week or bi-weekly, depending on the frequency that we're looking at what's been saved, and just give a quick scroll. Who's getting money, who's giving money, what else pops out. You might try a few national things. This is different than that Candid. So Candid's the main umbrella over Foundation Directory Online. Candid has a site that lists all that they've caught in terms of coronavirus grants, in terms of COVID specific funding. Great listing. And you can just keep an eye on it to see what changes each week. That's not a bad idea, to use Visual Ping to see what changes from week to week. But this is giving you, again, kind of that feeling, the safety net that we're not missing extra things that might be so small or so local that Candid might not pick up on it. That's what it's helping us to catch. And it just takes a few minutes to read through the link titles. Occasionally you click through one. It's okay if they don't all feel relevant, but it's keeping it in your kind of your field of vision so that, again, you can tell your colleagues, you can tell your board, your leadership, we're watching for everything, using all our tips, the tricks, our tools. The toolbox is as full as it can be so that we don't miss anything. Because that really is the last step here, is to help the colleagues know that you've got a bunch of different ways that you're watching. We are so grateful for when they forward us things, and we have a cadence with which we look at it on our calendar. Because then when we find something, we'll circle back to that grant team, we'll give them a well-framed draft so that they can give direct input, direct information to help make a great application. Oh, doesn't that feel calming? Okay, maybe you're like, that feels really easy. Now there's a lot of resources and there's a lot of key questions, things that are coming up a lot. Oh, and so to reiterate, because I've been talking about a lot of things. I've been talking about National Council on Nonprofits and Grant Station and Candid. Here are the direct links. We're slide 36. You'll have the handout from this as well as the recording. Candid is where you'll find that full listing that they're maintaining of COVID-specific funders. We use those Google alerts to make sure we're not missing something more locally than that. So when we think of some of the key questions, I've got a few stocked ready to go, but I'm curious, what questions do you have? And if you have any that you're like, oh, I don't know if I want to ask this here or if it's the right time, you can also always email me and I'll answer your questions. We can set a time to talk, or I can just reply to an email. But go ahead and start typing in some of your organization's COVID concerns, COVID and grant concerns, I should say. We'll keep the grant hat on. But what are some of those grant-related concerns that I can help give answers or suggestions, recommendations to? As you're typing, I'll share with you one of the common things that I've seen happen right now, concerns and questions I'm getting. Grant makers are remote, or they've furloughed staff, or they've gone to a part-time working schedule, right? Like things are different, and we're not always sure how they're different with the grant makers. So what if we're a current grantee and we have a report that's due and we've asked for an extension, or we asked a question about the portal, or we had a question about our bill we're submitting for reimbursement, fill in the blank, and they're not getting back to us? What do I do? That's really very common right now. So know that you're not alone. Be persistent. Reach out over email. Try phone the next time. Try a second email, right? Our inboxes are completely overwhelmed, so it might be that they just missed it. So keep track of your communication and don't give up. But if it comes to something really, I'll say serious, like a budget justification modification, or a budget expense classification change, or something for a report that's due, but the portal's not working, you know how to kind of judge the level of seriousness. Maybe you want to try a general outreach to that funder. So there is a foundation, I will let them remain nameless, that had a portal open. It's a New York State focused foundation, and they were not getting back to grantees about requests for extensions, which they had actually emailed and offered. It said, if you need a no-cost extension, just let us know. And then they said nothing, like crickets, nothing. What do? You're like, so did you grant the extension? Did you grant my budget modification? I don't know. Can I act on it, or do I have to sit? So what could you do in that situation? You've done everything you can to reach out to that contact. Definitely try reaching out to like a general info email address or a phone number for the whole office to say, I'm looking for some clarification. Is there someone that could help me? You don't necessarily need to go up the chain. You can actually go maybe down or more generally in the organization, because the grant makers are run by people, just like your organization, and everyone's, well, we're having a time, aren't we? Whew, let's just say it. And so you're going to want to maybe reach out and spider connect to a few other folks in the organization, and that's okay. It might be something really different than what we would normally do in a normal year. I hate to even, I'm like, what is normal anymore? So some of our practices are different, and that's probably one of the most common things I'm seeing happen now between nonprofits and their current grant makers, is that the responsiveness or the paths of communication have, at least in the short term, been different. And so you might need to try something a little bit different. So I hope sharing that story helps, because it's a question that's coming up a lot when I'm teaching and within our own clients. So you're not alone. Go down the chain, go up the chain, don't give up, just be patient and polite. As long as we keep the patient and polite piece in our communications with the grant makers, we'll be just fine. What other questions do you have? That was what I predicted would be a burning question, but what are those things that your board's asking, or your colleagues are asking, or you're asking? Go ahead and either type them in the chat box, or if you want to unmute and verbally ask them, that'd be fine too. I'm happy to have the discussion or the questions come in that way. Oh, and I see another question that's coming in is that, thanks, and you can message me privately too if you want to ask a question that way, so that way maybe your colleagues don't know who asked what, that's fine. Another question that has come up is when we think about talking about the impact, right, where does that go? Like, where are we getting new data? When we think about our data sources, they lag, right? So where are we getting the most meaningful data that talks about the impact in our community? On what are we seeing for, like, how current is the unemployment data we're seeing? What are we seeing in terms of domestic violence calls from the police department? What are we seeing in terms of income data for our community and how we might use that in our applications? The answers are that it's a lag, and our grant makers understand that. I mean, let's talk about the fact that we just saw that as a whole, American median income has gone up. But that's last year's data. That's not talking about what's happening right now, right? So if that was the data we used without a big asterisk and like, this is what we know is happening now based on unemployment data, et cetera, it needs context. So I'd ask around, I'd talk to your colleagues to see what hyper-local data has been collected. We've seen some United Ways start to collect and share data, some community foundations. I know that it's not New York, but in San Francisco, there was an organization that said, you know what, dear funders, if you'll help us, we will aggregate data, we'll gather and do some survey work. So that's something also that you might consider is how with your peers and your colleagues, how you can say this is data we need that we don't have yet, and it's data that we only need that's different than usual because of COVID. You might need to ask for some funding for it, or maybe it's something you can do, but you could also collaborate to find some of that data that is currently sort of in limbo, we'll say. So an ongoing issue as you think about what you're going to pull into your needs statement.
I have a question. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Okay. I'm wondering if you can tell me if you have seen foundations expanding their funding priorities out of the place where they normally make grants from. Like, to what extent, I guess is my question, if at all, that you have seen foundations sort of opening up to account for all of the need, particularly in our space and DV. Are you seeing that foundations are moving, moving their goalpost of what they're funding because of what's happening right now?
So the answer is sort of. So, and this is where we would probably go back to our magic 8-ball. It's so specific to each grant maker that the only way to know who's really changing and who's not is by asking, because we've seen some that say, absolutely not, I'm not changing what we're doing at all. We are who we are, we're not changing. And then we've seen others that say, oh my gosh, of course we're changing who we are, at least in the short term. And they're not making long-term commitments about what they might do differently, but they're saying for right now, our board met and this is what we're gonna do. And some do it very publicly and you can see it on their website, others don't. And that's part of why that relationship outreach I talked about to start is so important, because we can't tell unless they have very publicly told us on their website or on social media somewhere, like this is how we're changing. We almost should assume they may have, and we need to ask to find out what they're doing, right? And so either they told us we didn't at all, or they told us we absolutely did. Those are kind of our extremes. So if we think about like a bell curve, right, there are outliers. Most are not that transparent about it. Most are somewhere in the middle, and the only way we can figure out is by asking.
Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, it means a lot of outreach and communication to figure it out. And I think that, as the fall starts, we'll see what happens. Foundations that are on a calendar year might have made a choice about how they were handling this year's grants. Are they going to release a change for next year? Are they going to leave it sort of in limbo? I'm on the edge of my seat waiting to find out too. That's really where I'm sitting now. Like, okay, we've seen what they've done. What are they going to do for their 2021 budgets? I think that's going to be I hate to say an interesting thing to watch. I don't want to feel passive about it, but I think we're going to have to continue to ask because there's a lot of unknown as we head into the next year.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Cheryl. maybe not the answer you were hoping for. Anyone else have questions they want to unmute and ask?
Hey, Diane, it's Connie.
Yes.
Any thoughts about really looking at domestic violence issues from the perspective of the time that we're in right now is really a combination of domestic violence within the midst of this public health disaster. So any thoughts about really building the case with funders about long-term support, something that's more sustainable? I think sometimes with projects that might only be 1 year in length, it's really tough to continue the work. So any ideas or strategies that you have in kind of thinking through building the case for a longer term commitment from funders to look at perhaps 2 or 3 years or more, if that's a trend that is even possible right now for funders to consider?
Yeah, I mean, right, multi-year grants are, I don't want to say the holy grail, but they're the ideal because it gives you a longer runway to know what's happening and how can we plan, what can happen with staff support. Absolutely, it's an ideal. You know, in terms of multi-year commitments right now, it might be something that maybe you're not asking for a grant maker to change your designation the way we talked about in the talking points, but maybe you're saying, to help us have longer term planning and sustainability, might you now, I know you're usually an annual funder, might you consider making a multi-year commitment to us? Maybe will you make a 2-year grant instead? I think that's a fair conversation you can have with your current funders that are single-year funders. I think that's actually a really nice idea. If you're looking at new funders and you're thinking about sustainability, getting a new funder to make a multi-year grant commitment that's hard, right? That's really, really hard. Possible, but really hard. Instead, I think it's an opportunity that you can, as you talk with new grant makers, talk about, do you have any other multi-year commitments? Who else do you have that supports you? How can you bring them in as a new funder that could support a diversified funding strategy, and maybe be transparent that your goal is you love to have multi-year funding partnerships and long-term relationships, so that you plant the seed in their minds that this is a great organization, and if we like this first year, maybe we would consider making a 2-year grant to them. I think always bringing up the conversation would be my suggestion, but like I said, if it's a current funder and you don't need to change your current budget, your current award, that's a great thing to ask instead. Like, what are you thinking? Could we have an extension? Like, add money and give us an extension so that we can plan in a stronger way moving forward. If maybe they're not willing to make 2 years, but maybe they'll make 18 months or add 6 months on now and throw some extra dollars on to do that. That could be another idea too. Okay. There's such great questions. Are there others?
I do have one more. It's Connie again.
Sure.
Just a thought here from the perspective of some of the challenges that domestic violence programs are facing here in the state of New York with government funding and just some of the unknowns of, again, what's going to happen within the state budget. What are your thoughts about reaching out to private funders and really talking about the landscape of government support and the challenges that domestic violence programs are facing? And are there maybe some particular strategies or talking points or ideas that you have to help bring the awareness of private funders to the place where there's an incredible need in order to maintain support for domestic violence services from also the private sector?
Right. So I think talking about the federal landscape, the state landscape, what you're seeing, what the projections are, you might use it as a way to talk about the need to further diversify so that you are building more private partnerships so that you are not exclusively reliant, or as maybe it's not as big of a percentage of your funding right now if government funding is a big piece. pointing to, I mean, I don't think in New York that if it's a New York-based foundation, I don't think there will be any surprise for what they've seen with the governor calling for like cuts and what's going to happen to the budget without federal support. So, but pointing to those, giving some source data to why are you worried, why are you trying to make sure that you have diverse funding, that it's not all government, that you're increasing foundations. That might be incredibly helpful, maybe not so much in your narrative, but in the outreach and conversations via email and phone to give the context for why it's so important that you build partnerships. Does that help, Connie?
Yes, it does. Thank you, Diane.
Yeah. And I think so much, so much has changed. And so the more that you can bring your most current data to the conversation to say in the work that each of you are doing, here's what we might have previously said, but like, this is what's happening right now. And this is how we're seeing an increase in demand for our services. This is how we've modified our services in the situation, or this is how we've increased our outreach, or, right? Everyone has a list of all the things that you're doing that are different. And so to highlight that, you could say different, oh, well, we could just move some budget. Different usually does also mean probably is going to cost us more. And so I would argue that each of you have expanded and enhanced the way in which you deliver your mission as a result of the last 6 months. And that as you look forward in the next 6, 12, it's a continued expansion and enhancement of how you deliver your mission. So make sure that you tell the grant makers that when you're reaching out. I'm reaching out to you because we're expanding and enhancing the way in which we deliver our mission, and we need additional support. So I think that would be another way to frame it, is don't sell yourself short. You have absolutely changed the game. Use the big words of expanding and enhancing. Don't feel bad about it. That's really what you are. Well, I see Connie asked a question in the chat box too. Do I have any thoughts about funding for evaluation to show the outcomes and effectiveness of our work? Yeah, right, evaluation is expensive. And so if you can get specific funding for showing outcomes, for tracking evaluation, yes, that's a good thing. So I'm like, going to ask you a question on the fly, Connie. You might want to verbally answer or type back quickly, but is that something, I don't know the history of how you as the member organization, how maybe you have helped collaborate on applications like that before, or brought together groups to say we could evaluate across multiple organizations or across the whole network?
Well, I think that's been a situation where we've done a little bit of work in this area around evaluation, and looking at some of the researchers out there that are familiar with the work of domestic violence, about what questions to ask, which is such a major component of evaluation. But I think that there are opportunities when we're talking with funders. They want to know the data, show us the numbers, show us that your programs and services work, so that we know that our investment is really paying off from the funder's perspective. And so I think that there are probably some opportunities that we can really look at to have more of a coordinated process, perhaps, available across the state with domestic violence services. I think sometimes there's definitely this element of education for funders to know and understand domestic violence first off, because their measures of success might be very different than the measures of success that we might think of around survivor safety and really wanting to move in the direction of preventing domestic violence in the future. So I think it's one of those opportunities where there's a lot of potential, and it's trying to throw that evaluation mix in to be able to respond to requests from funders, at the same time making sure that there's enough support in place and appropriate levels of support in place for domestic violence programs that are doing incredibly difficult and hard life-saving work around our state. So that's also a little bit of the balance of where we're at right now.
Yeah, well, it makes sense. And so I think because everything's changing right now, right, any opportunity that either individual member organizations have or you as an umbrella organization with members can do to try and build evaluation into a budget or directly seek together to acknowledge things are different, services are different. You know, we need to do some of it different evaluation right now to just to see effectiveness and also for planning for the future. So yeah, I think it's an important conversation and could be one of the things that you have as like a menu of what you need when you talk to grant makers right now, for sure. Yep. Great. Any other questions or concerns? You've got my email address. You'll have the slides and the recording by tomorrow morning. Takes a little bit for all of it to sync. But are there other questions I can answer before I let you return to your day? No, okay, I'll take the silence then as a no. I like to give a moment of a pause. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. More than that, I want to say thank you for all the work that you're doing to support your community, the individuals in your community. And it was an honor to be with you to talk about this. If we can answer any additional questions, by all means, please do reach out. Happy to, answer, like I said, over email or hop on the phone, have a quick virtual cup of coffee and talk through any concerns you have about how grants are happening in your organization and how maybe you could tweak or strengthen or reach out to a funder in a different way. Definitely, please do reach out. Well, thank you again for being with us, and we'll have that recording and the slides for you very shortly. Have a wonderful day.